to keep that under control? What can we do to ensure that we are doing the least possible harm to the environment, and that those who are concerned about it are informed about what's going on? And that's exactly the role a university should play, hosting events, making sure that our students, when they go out from here, understand the issues and are able to inform others and to affect change themselves. So really, that's what I would like to do from my point of view. Welcome to Chatham, welcome to the Thought School, and if I can, I'll hand it over to Preston from the League of Women Voters, who have organised tonight's event, and leave it to Preston. Thanks very much.
If you don't have to change your glasses, I'm actually a man, and I'm representing the League of Women Voters. You'll be surprised to know that the League has been accepting men into their select group since 1978. It happens that tonight, one of the major things that the League is involved with, of course, is public forums for candidates who are running for office. And in Allegheny County, we have an interesting campaign going on for the job of controller for the county. The debate between those two candidates is tonight in O'Hare Township. And so many of the people involved with the League of Women Voters are there rather than here. But this particular project is very important to the League of Women Voters, both of the greater Pittsburgh area, but also the state of Pennsylvania. This is a project called the Straight Scoop on Shale. And this is, I believe, maybe the third forum that has been presented here in the Pittsburgh region dealing with all the concerns about fracking, natural gas and oil exploration, and all of the related health and other issues associated with it. Tonight, we're going to be primarily focusing on waste. In another life, I was a elected official in Upper St. Clair, and we have, of course, an engineer. And her name, she's a woman, and her name is Ruth Ann Ulmer, and she calls herself the sewer queen. Well, nothing glamorous about being involved with sewers and waste and whatever, but it's extraordinarily important and fundamental to keeping us alive. So we'd like to welcome you here from the perspective of the League of Women Voters, and thank you for supporting this project. And in addition, I'd like at this point to turn it over to our moderator, Stephanie Rittenbell, who you read once a week, I'm sure, in the Post-Gazette for the Power Source Center.
Hi, and thank you all for coming. My name is Stephanie Rittenbell, and I'm a business reporter and editor for the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette's energy section called Power Source. Power Source launched about a year and a half ago, early 2014, and it was launched as a resource for news coverage into energy production, which has always been a very critical part of this region, from the early days of oil production to the legacy of coal in this region to innovations in energy efficiency and renewables, and now natural gas production from the Marcellus and Utica shale. In a moment, I'll introduce the speakers, and each one will give a presentation, which will be followed by a question and answer session about 7 o'clock. And if you would like to ask a question, we encourage you to do so. Please take one of the index cards provided and hold it up. Somebody will be around to collect it and send them up this way. So our first speaker this evening will be Nadia Stenzor, who is the Eastern Program Coordinator of the Oil and Gas Sustainability Project at Earthworks, a national organization dedicated to protecting communities and the environment from the impacts of mining and energy development. Following her will be Scott Perry, the Deputy Secretary of the Office of Oil and Gas Administration at the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection. He directs oil and gas planning and program management, oversees the development of policy, as well as regulatory and technical guidance on oil and gas activities here in the state. Doug Keller is the Vice President of Environmental Engineering for Pittsburgh-based Seneca Resources, which is the exploration production segment of National Fuel Gas Company. Carl Spadero is the Environmental General Manager and Corporate Officer for Max Environmental Technologies, a Pittsburgh area company that provides waste treatment, remediation, and disposal services for the energy, metals, and other industries, as well as government-funded cleanups. and Barbara Lucia is the volunteer citizen activist of the West Side Alliance of Warren, Pennsylvania. So first up is Nadia, who will be actually joining us by Skype.
Hello, everyone. Hi, everyone. Hi. Thanks so much for having me, and to Chatham University for making it possible for me to be with you via technology, since I'm living in New York and I wasn't able to travel today to get to you. So I'm going to just put my presentation up here. Okay, I think that works. So thanks again to the League of Women Voters and to Chatham for having me tonight and for choosing this topic. And as somewhat, can everyone hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. And as was said earlier, waste is not a glamorous topic. There are many, many aspects to oil and gas development. And waste is not always glamorous, but I think we can all agree it's an extremely important one from a health and environmental standpoint. And it's also one of the most challenging issues that industry and residents and regulators have to contend with. So I'm going to give an overview of some of the key concerns around waste and why it is so challenging, and then get us into a bit into the conversation about where to go next. So the first question is, why all the fuss now? I'll give you a bit of context. We've had oil and gas development in the United States for decades, and we're about 7 or 8 years into the shale oil and gas boom. And yet, there's just been this really a surge of interest in the waste issues in just the last period of time. And so there are a few reasons for that. I think that one is just the scale of change that has occurred. We now have over 1 million active oil and gas wells in the U.S., and more wells means more waste to manage and dispose of. And there are about 137,000 permitted wells, a bit more later. The second reason is development is just closer to home for people. A lot of more people are paying more attention to energy development ever since fracking came on the scene, and as development has moved much closer to urban areas and more populated states, such as in the East. And so as people become more concerned about the impacts, waste is on more people's radar. I think there's also been what we've been calling it Earthworks, a create now and figure it out later approach. There's been a very strong focus on production, getting the gas in particular out of the ground. And so we're in a situation now where regulators and advocates in the public and perhaps also industry are having, and certainly science is catching up on some of the impacts, and that applies to waste as well. There's also been a slew of new studies and emerging science and new information about waste products and questioning, the basic issue of how toxic and radioactive is the waste. And that's been just in the last few years that we've had that work done. And then there are growing concerns about capacity. As we drill more and drill deeper, can the current methods of testing and tracking and disposal handle these growing volumes? So I'm just going to give a very quick overview what we mean by waste. I know that when I started working on these issues, I had to get up to speed on these different terms. So here's a little primer. What is the waste? Why is it of concern? And where does it ultimately go? So just a very general overview. You have your liquid wastes, which are primarily produced water, which is the water that's been in the formation, such as shale, for millions of years and is brought up from underground during the fracturing and drilling process. And then there is flowback, which is actually the water and the fluids that are injected by human beings into the formation to develop the oil or gas that then return to the surface. And the primary concerns with these wastes are the high levels of salts, volatile organic compounds, chemicals, and potential radioactivity. And the way they're being handled currently, and again, this is very general overview, is they're generally stored at the well site and then treated and either discharged or reused, discharged into rivers and streams or reused. A lot of liquid waste also is injected underground in underground injection control wells, and it's also spread on our land and roads. And then there are the solid wastes, which are primarily drill cuttings, which is the ground-up rock, ground-up shale from the formation. And they are of concern because of all the chemicals and different fluids, as well as salts and radioactivity. These are generally also stored at the well site. They're often left behind at the well site through burial. They go to landfills, and if they test at a high enough level of radioactivity, they will go to specialized facilities for disposal. And then there's everything in between. You know, it's often hard to tell, is it a liquid, is it a solid, and sometimes liquids have to be separated from the solids to manage it. So you've got your muds, your sludges, fracturing sand, which comes back up after drilling. And those also are concerned with the fluids and chemicals, oil. They're also stored at the well site. They're often solidified with other materials, such as wood chip or coal ash. They might be buried on site, or they go to landfills. So just as a very quick primer on what waste is, and I'm going to give you an equally quick primer on how we got to the point that we are in history with how oil and gas waste is defined and managed. You may have heard reference to the hazardous waste loophole for the oil and gas industry, and what this refers to is that in 1988, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency determined that oil and gas field waste did not have to be regulated under the nation's solid and hazardous waste law, which is the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, also called RCRA. And the reasons for this, EPA made that determination based on two key reasons. One is that they decided that state regulations are adequate and the states could manage it, didn't require federal oversight. And the other reason is that the classification of waste as hazardous would be very expensive for the industry to deal with and hamper its expansion. But the tricky thing for EPA at the time, and for everyone who's followed this issue for nearly 30 years, is that the study that underpinned that determination actually found that much of the waste, about 10 to 70% of the oil and gas waste, would actually be considered hazardous if the exemption did not exist. So EPA acknowledged that. And the RCRA definition of hazardous is if waste is ignitable, corrosive, reactive, or toxic, which is now being asked, that definition is being applied to current waste, and a lot of people are asking, well, might it actually be hazardous? So I'll just leave this history lesson with a quote. The EPA has continued to recognize the trickiness of defining the waste and the potential that it's hazardous. In a publication in 2002 on the hazardous waste exemption, the EPA stated, although they are relieved from regulation as hazardous waste, the exemption does not mean that these wastes could not present a hazard to human health and the environment if improperly managed. So there's some double negatives in there, but what they're basically saying is just because it's exempt does not mean it isn't hazardous. So that's a very important thing to keep in mind as we go forward. So here we are nearly 30 years later and several years into a shale boom. And so Earthworks decided to take a comprehensive look at how states are doing and whether they are actually managing waste adequately as the EPA felt that they were at the time. And we were having a hard time really getting much information on waste. So we decided to do this report, which we issued this past April, and it's called Wasting Away. I think there's some executive summaries out on the table, and even though I primarily wrote it, I can say it's a very dense report and welcome you to read the summary. So we looked at 4 states in the Marcellus and Utica shales, so Pennsylvania, Ohio, New York, and West Virginia. And we did a pretty deep deep analysis of current regulations and policies governing waste, looked at all of the data that's available, and just tried to talk to a lot of people, looked at all the science that was coming out of the different areas. And we came up with 4 general, again, these are overview conclusions. And one is that, the states, all of the states in question really recognize the growing problem of waste, and to their credit are stepping up to make some regulatory and policy changes so that to reduce the risks. Unfortunately, at the current time, the efforts are very piecemeal. They're often reactive. If there's a problem on the ground or a new issue arises, then the agencies attempt to deal with it. And there are wide regulatory gaps which leave a lot of waste, untracked and undefined, and the risks are persistent. Another thing we found was that in all the states, waste is classified as residual or solid, which means that it's disposed of and treated using current waste methods, like wastewater treatment plants in some cases, and municipal landfills. We also really found, and this was very frustrating in writing this report actually, that the reporting and tracking and testing of waste is quite limited, and that operators, the companies themselves, and the disposal facilities also have wide discretion in how to define and manage waste. Is it a liquid? Is it a solid? Does it have radioactive content? How much do we test it before we put it into the ground, etc. And there's none of the states that we looked at have any what is called cradle-to-grave oversight. So from the moment of creation to the moment of disposal, where does the waste go? How is it managed? Who has control over it? Does it get lost along the way? There's really none of that kind of oversight going on, which is very troubling if you want to get a full picture of the problem, as well as ensuring that water, air, and health are protected. And then the final thing is there's just a blurry picture. As I mentioned, it was often very difficult to get information. I will say that Pennsylvania has made a very good effort, and I know is attempting to do more to get operator data online and publicly available. But at the current time, it's very difficult, especially if you're looking at regionally, to assess the volume of waste, types of waste, and where it's actually going, and what happens when it gets there. So I'll just end with a quick overlook in Pennsylvania, and I'm sure other folks on the panel will cover this more. The volumes of waste are rising precipitously. We looked at operator data that was reported to the DEP, and just for the Marcellus shale wells, between 2011 and 2014, nearly 130 million barrels of liquid waste were created, which was a 104% increase during that period. And during that same period, there were over 5 million tons of solid waste, which was over a 500% increase during the period. So you can see that we have tremendous growing volumes. And most of the waste is disposed of and dealt with in the state. Some of it goes to neighboring states, primarily Ohio, West Virginia, and New York. And the DEP has taken some steps to address concerns, especially as science has emerged, such as limits for new treatment facilities on certain substances. And they also issued a voluntary request for drillers not to take the waste to wastewater treatment plants, municipal wastewater treatment plants. And then at the end of 2014, the DEP also completed the most comprehensive study to date on radiation in waste, which is a really important resource. And we're currently in the midst of revisions to oil and gas regulations, known as Chapter 78 and 78A, and that includes a lot of aspects of waste management, and the comments are due on May 19th, and I encourage you all to get involved. It's a really great opportunity for public engagement to weigh in on this concern. The key recommendations that we've come up with for Pennsylvania, as well as every other state, is for the state to really consider applying hazardous waste policies to oil and gas. You know, the question going back to the RCRA determination, if it walks like a duck and talks like a duck and is found to have the characteristics of hazardous, might it not be better to regulate it as such and ensure that the waste is kept out of our soils and water as a result. And it would also require this cradle-to-grave tracking, which would really help get a handle on it.
Use it for hydraulic fracturing. But if they are recycling, currently they can just say it's being reused for something other
In
than
California, drilling on national forest. So obviously everybody loves me, loves the company. It makes for interesting circumstances, but because of those circumstances, we've taken a very unique approach for the different things that we do. I was listening to some of the data about water recycling and water use, and to Scott's point, one of the best methods of controlling flowback water is the reuse of that water. So when you have an active drilling program, you're able to reuse that within the facility. Seneca at this point is a net recycler of water from a company perspective, but we also are a net recycler of water by taking other flowback water and reusing that in our operations. When we were doing water withdrawals, one of the projects that people talked about was the fact that we're using coal mine drainage water. So a water that wasn't as clean. As a result of that particular project, there's a stream in Tioga County which is now gone from an endangered stream to one that has miles of cleaner water. And it's that unique approach that we have. We talk about the drill cuttings that were going to landfills. And we had worked with the Pennsylvania DEP to start a pilot program with a Philadelphia-based company, and we have a beneficial reuse of drill cuttings. So our drill cuttings don't go to landfill. They're used as part of brownfield recovery. They're cleaned on location, and they're reused. When we talk about the pad liners, for example, I think that's another area that certainly as we think of water quality control, but all of our pad liners are cleaned on site, shredded, and ultimately they're repurposed into those plastic bumpers that you see in front of parking spaces that used to be concrete, as well as the plastic mailboxes that some of you may have in front of your homes, as well as boat pilings and a variety of other things. So we've tried to, as a company, be responsible across our operations to find ways that we can reuse, repurpose not just the water, but a variety of things. Another point that came up was the use of pits. Seneca does not use pits. We work with a company called ETC, Environmental Tank and Container, out of Johnstown. Great recovery story. They had a sheltered plant that was from World War II that was inactive, and they started that back up and hired 50, 60 people, and they're making water tanks for us as part of our operations. Great family-owned business. And so, again, just something that we've been in front of. Because we work not only in Pennsylvania, we work in California, I can honestly say, based on my job, I spend a lot of time in Harrisburg and time in Sacramento, that the Chapter 78 regulations are very stringent, and out in California, it's SB 4. I had the opportunity to meet with the EPA just this past week. One of the areas specifically was the director of the UIC program, and it actually was flattering to hear them say that there are basically 3 states that they constantly watch because of the progressiveness that they take, and it was Pennsylvania, Texas, and California. And part of that is because you have the larger plays that are taking place here, but you have that activity. And I bring that up, it's because where drilling activity is, just like any other business, technology follows. So as long as there's active drilling, you're going to have a variety of groups that otherwise weren't looking to solve issues come into this play and come up with creative solutions. But between the two, I think there's an interesting opportunity that we have, but we all come to accept that we like certain niceties. A hot shower in the morning, warm meals, and we need to find collectively the way that we can enjoy.
And some waste, because there was different readings depending on who was taking sample at what time, either at the source of waste generation at the landfill or treatment facility, and what time of day.
The first one I have is...
Get that, Nadia?
Louder, please.
Okay, and can everybody hear me okay?
Yeah.
Good. This, I'm sorry?
Yeah, that's fine if other people aren't freaked out by it.
The first question I have is for Scott Perry. Scott Perry acknowledged the need for better tracking of wastewater. As I understand it, companies currently tracking wastewater transportation and disposal, and the DEP can request that information. Only if the DEP requests the information can the public then request to see it. Does the department have specific plans to incorporate public transparency into improved tracking?
Well, first of all, for the wastes that the drillers generate, you can go onto our website today and see what was generated on a well-by-well basis and where it went. If it's a permitted facility like Max, they will list the permit number. The one area that we don't have enough specificity on, in our opinion, is for these, if they're recycling flowback water, we don't know which well site that went to. So that's part of the proposed changes to require that they identify the facility where that flowback water went. The other thing that we want to do is harmonize the way the waste is reported. I think this goes to Carl's issue of consistency, where some of our treatment facilities are reporting it one way and the drillers are reporting it a different way, so it makes it look like the records don't match up, and sometimes they legitimately don't match up. But we need to have a consistent method of reporting, both from the facilities that receive it and for the generators, to eliminate that confusion. And we need to talk about perhaps having the receiving facilities report electronically on a routine basis as well.
To achieve that consistency between how the DEP tracks this information and how the drillers get it, what will it take to harmonize that?
Well, it's really just a matter of having our guidance documents define with specificity, what certain wastes have to be, what waste code needs to be utilized, and admittedly, that has not happened yet.
Is there a timeline?
We don't actually have a defined timeline for that project, but it'll be this year.
The next question, how to characterize the pollution related to pipelines and how to avoid it? I would imagine that might be in terms of emissions that are related to pipeline activities.
I can, National Fuel is our parent company, and as part of that, we have everything from the drill bit to the burner tip, including between 3,000 and 4,000 miles of pipeline. A couple of different things that we're looking at, and obviously, one source of pollution comes during the time when you're cutting and prepping that line, because obviously you're removing trees and you have vegetation and exposure, just like you would with well pad, and quite frankly, as you would in good construction, you have erosion controls that are located around that area. A couple of things that we try to do, and we live and learn. We improve based on mistakes or at the urging of Scott to find different ways to go about it. But we used to open trench longer sections, now we open trench shorter sections. That way you have less exposed dirt and less probability of erosion, and you work from there. If you're talking from an air and emission standpoint, we're again trying some creative things that are new to this basin. We use a ultrasonic and infrared detection system to detect methane. So if we have leaks, we also have a sensor system that can detect pipe strikes, intentional and unintentional. And that technology will improve as we go along. So those are two areas. I'm not sure if that covers exactly the question, but from the two main concerns that we see are either from the air perspective of methane leaks and then from a vegetation standpoint. For those who live in the northern tier, and have seen old pipeline growth that, one of the things that we do now is we'll lay multiple lines in that right-of-way, and oftentimes we'll lay multiple lines in that right-of-way whether we need that line or not. So thus you have earth disturbance at one time, and it lessens future earth disturbance. Of course, there may be pipe repair, pipe replacement, and other projects that will go on, but it gives us that opportunity. And then that allows some of the foliage to come back around. Obviously, the top of the tree canopy might close in, but the bottom is going to be the width of that pipeline cut, but then the pipeline cut doesn't look as obvious.
So the other air emission issue with pipeline would be the compressor stations. And there's been some concern that there's particulate matter emissions that are affecting public health. And some of those concerns are based on monitoring that was done around older